So in this video, I'm just going to walk you through CVSS scoring and give you some general tips behind things to keep in mind when you're doing bug bounties. So what CVSS allows us to do is it allows us to score out a vulnerability to determine how severe it is. This is going to help you look a lot more reputable when you're reporting your vulnerabilities if you're able to describe the exact impact of the vulnerabilities. So this will help you think about the sort of things that you really need to consider with a vulnerability and be able to understand the general impact to see, for one, is it actually a vulnerability? And for two, how substantial is this and how really critical is it? So in general, what we go based off is the exploitability metrics for the base scores, right? So we take a look at the base score matrix mostly. Now, when we're taking a look at this, there's a few things that we want to consider. The first thing is the attack vector. How can an attacker manage to get this attack to execute successfully? Can they just send data over the network? Do they have to be on the same network as us? Do they have to be actually on the device locally, or do they have to have physical access to the device? To give you an example, suppose that we were doing an exploit that allowed us to, send SQL injections through content providers, for instance. In order to execute this, we have to be able to access the actual device itself, which means we have to be local. I can't send any network data to exploit a content provider, at least in the cases that we saw. So these would be local vulnerabilities. The attack complexity discusses how hard it is to really get the attack to be completed successfully. And when we're talking about complexity, we're mostly talking about if I can send a query to the content provider and it works 100% of the time, that's going to be low attack complexity. If you have to send the query at a very specific time and maybe 50% of the time it actually works, that would be higher attack complexity. So in general, if we're just sending queries, we're going to say that that's a low attack complexity. Privileges required discusses how many privileges you need on the system or through the application in order to exploit this. So do you need to be can you be unauthenticated and do it? Do you need to be authorized as some form of user? Do you need to be authorized as an administrator or someone with a high level of privilege? In general, with content providers, as long as we are on the device and installed, we don't need to deal with any sort of privileges. So we actually don't need any privileges with the application to execute this. For user interaction, it's asking, does the user actually have to interact with us in order to be exploited? So for instance, if I have to send a link to the user and convince them to click it, that would require user interaction. For most of the content provider type exploits, we would have to convince the user to install an application, which would mean that you would need user interaction to do that. For scope, we're discussing, are we staying in the same scope as the user who's being exploited, or are we able to escalate our privileges to become an administrator or something like that? So in this case, we aren't able to do anything drastic. We're just able to get user data. So our scope is generally unchanged. And then we're taking a look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are the three core aspects of computer security. We want to keep these as much as possible. Confidentiality means that you can leak data that you shouldn't be able to get access to. So for instance, if you can see passwords, that's pretty high confidentiality impact. If you can potentially see the user's first name, that's probably a low confidentiality impact. And if you can't get any data, then you don't have any confidentiality impact. So in the case of our SQL injection, let's assume that you can see a database full of passwords. So we'll just say it's a high confidentiality risk. Integrity is looking at data that you can edit. Can you actually alter data at all? So, if you can alter data that is significantly important and causes a huge impact, that's a high level. If you can, edit data that's sort of trivial, then that's a low level. If you can't edit any data, then there's no integrity impact. Typically with SQL injections, we can edit data. So let's assume that we can edit any data in the database. That would be a high integrity impact. And then availability means, can we deny typical users service? So, can we shut down a server so that no one can actually access it anymore? With SQL injections, you can potentially chain it to get denial of service, but it really depends on the context. We could say that there's a low availability risk because a lot of the time we can, manage to deny service in some way. And this gives you your base score, which is a 7.3 out of 10. So it's out of 10. 7.3 is considered in the high range typically. So the higher your CVSS score, the more critical it is. So that's the general idea of how we can score out our vulnerabilities. So when you report a vulnerability, I always advise people to score out the vulnerability. That way, when it comes to a security researcher like myself, I can look at it and say, okay, yep, this is a high level vulnerability. We want to prioritize this. It just helps to make the process a bit easier. The next tip that I'm going to give you is the idea of writing reports that are actually reproducible. When you send in a report, what you should do is you should give a step-by-step instruction so that, if I receive the report, sort of assume that I know absolutely nothing about what you're talking about, nothing about the application at all. I want you to convince me that you can come into the application by following a set amount of steps, manage to get something to happen, and then tell me what that thing is that you're getting to happen and what impact it has towards the application that I'm supporting. That's the general idea of what you should be doing when you're running up your reports. You should be, explaining it in a way that is extremely convincing and very easy to replicate. I typically go step by step. I'll have screenshots along the way. I'll explain every single detail and really help them out with maybe remediations as well. Say, I think that this is the cause of it and here's how you could fix it. The more information that you provide to them, the better off it's going to be, right? You'll potentially get higher rewards, or you'll be able to, make them, more likely to reward you in general because they're easily able to reproduce your vulnerabilities. And then aside from that, just general etiquette type things, make sure to work with the teams on disclosure processes, make sure that you help them to verify the fixes, and just generally act in good faith. And if you do that, you'll be well on your way to getting lots of good bug bounties and working with a lot of, good research teams and, earning lots of money. So I hope that this course was very helpful. Of course, if you have any sort of questions, please feel free to ask them through Udemy. I'd be happy to try to help you as much as I can.